Okay, good. Welcome to our Bucky Weekend Call for July 29th, 30, depending on which continent you're on. We're continuing our discussion of critical path. And Joe, I'm glad you're with us tonight. I hope how are you feeling and what do you intend to get out of the night? Because I know you're not feeling too well.
I'm not feeling 100%. But I'm happy to be here. It's an honor to be here with everybody. It's good to see you, John. As far as my expectation for tonight, just to build a little bit on last week, and I'm happy to have our main reader back, and so I'm looking forward to just listening and actually taking in and hopefully walking away with one or two Bucky concepts reinforced or even new ones. With that, Manu, how do you feel? What are you taking away from today?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, it's happy to be here again with you guys, and I'm grateful for that. Last week we left on one thing that really kind of got my interest is the evolution of deeds to learn, evolve. Deeds to learn, evolve from deeds to arms. And it also the power structure, mergers and acquisition. And the whole story of how people or organization came to own land was quite interesting. And to me, it's something that is recurrent. It's always about, value created. How do you distribute it? How is it owned? How is it distributed? And how is it reinvested for the future? And that is something that is quite interesting. So I look forward for us to again link our reading of critical path to the issues that we have today and that we can anticipate coming. So on this, John, how do you feel? What do you expect?
I'm feeling good. It's a little overcast, but I've had a walk in the park, and that's always good. I always enjoy connecting with nature. And it's really good to be back. I'm hoping to be able to pick up on where you're at and rejoin the discussion and learn a bit more about Bucky. Always keen to learn a bit more about Bucky and the world as he saw it. It's a rapidly changing world. So I'm keen to reconnect. I suppose that's my priority. So Steve, how do you feel? What do you hope to take out of today?
Okay, well, I'm glad to be here. Bucky's understanding of history and the way he communicates evolution of human society and how people have learned to do more with less, and yet how the wealth seems to shift over and be in these corporations. I think the way he talks about the water people expanding and his idea of pirates, he's very, the fact that he was in the Navy and that he learned about a spherical Earth and spherical navigation. I don't know, his perspective on everything is just really unique. We're going to hear more about that as we continue. And here we are on page 70. And the chapter is called Legally Piggly, which is the idea of, I think that there are legal pigs and that people act like pigs legally. And we're going to hear more about that as we go. So some of his ideas in history, I think he has a low opinion of Egypt. I think that Egypt is a little bit cooler of a culture. But, he took his understanding at the time and he looked at natural resources and natural ways of navigation and really explains human evolution in a unique way. So I'm always interested in that point of view, and we're going to continue to read from there. So we're on page 70, and here we are right here. So John, if you don't mind reading, when you
Happy to
want to
read.
let us know, you know.
No, happy to read.
Wonderful.
So we'll start.
Right there at the top of the page, you can all see that.
There being as yet no Suez Canal, the new world power structure centred in the ship mastery of the line of supply, finally forcing the Roman Empire to shift its headquarters to Constantinople, some 10 centuries after the fall of Troy. The Roman Emperor Pope's bodyguards were the Vikings, the water people's most powerful frontier fighters. The line of supply from Asia to Constantinople was partially caravan-borne and partially waterborne via Sinkiang Khyber Pass, Afghanistan, or via the Sea of Azov, the Caspian and the Black Seas. From Constantinople, the Western Europe-bound traffic was rerouted from overland to waterway routes. Because the Asia to Constantinople half of the trading was more land-borne via caravans, whose routes were dominated by the city-state mastering Turks, Constantinople in due course was taken over by the Turks, who established the Byzantine Empire in the Aegean Sea and Asia Minor. Before leaving the subject of the great power structure struggle for control of the most important, greatest cargo tonnage transporting, most profitable Asia to Europe trade routes, we must note that the strength of the Egyptian Empire was predicated upon its pre-Suez function as a trade route link between Asia and Europe via the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, overland.
And now there's a page break, and here's this little diagram where he's showing these kinds of things. It'd probably be helpful to have the diagram sitting on the table as we continue to listen. Here's the
Can we
water.
just-
Go ahead.
Can we just make a comment on this picture?
Yeah.
It seems to me that, and it's just something that occurred to me now, that Bucky says the changes are not brought by ethnic people of places, but actually by the business and merchant people.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always an elite
Yeah.
that has mastered the technology,
Yeah.
and that sees the profit, and that conduct the flow of exchange of goods
Yeah.
from one place to other, thereby carrying with the expansion of technology to those places.
Yeah.
They are eventually overtaken by the local caste, but they are always the ones at the forefront, developing new routes, looking at new ways to ensure the expanding function. You remember always with Bucky, the expanding and the contraction. Is that understanding something that makes sense?
Yeah. Like he mentioned, the Roman emperor, powerful, the frontier fighters, there is an elite involved.
Yeah.
And these are the people who are controlling the power. And so when the land is across the water, there's a certain headquarters, and the headquarters is shifted because of that. And when the land is across, when the transport of the goods is across the land, then the centers shift based on that.
Yeah.
And
The Phoenicians are not a tribe. The Phoenicians is always, just hold there, you see, Phoenicians, Punkan, Venetians, Vikings, interrupted.
I never knew until I read Bucky that the Venetians and the Phoenicians had anything in common.
Yeah, and Vikings.
And Vikings and Vikings, yeah.
Yes. So these were always the traders. These were always those who were expanding things.
Yeah.
And it wasn't necessarily, kind of circumscribed to a tribe, circumscribed to a people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting prospect. And good. I noticed that too. Any other comments or questions? That map, I mean, the way he looks at the earth boggles my mind. I mean, here's Africa tilted on its side. Here's the Mediterranean Sea and the pre-Suez Canal. I mean, I look at the world so practically based on this movement of merchandise, which, you know, I don't know, you know, an American kid, America was always in the center of the universe, right? I mean, that's what we always saw America as, you know, and we had to learn that Australia was bigger than Texas, you know. I mean, that's how we learned about Australia in California, you know. Oh yeah, it's bigger than Texas. I don't know. I think, Manu, the way he shows the flow of energy, right? The flow of the money is really unique. I don't know if you can read that now, but let's see if we can. I'll try to tilt it down, John, so that you can like maybe start that sentence again and then finish it below the graphic, you know?
All right.
Okay, there we go.
Before leaving, the subject of the great power structure struggle for control of the most important, greatest cargo tonnage transporting most profitable Asia to Europe trade routes. We must note that the strength of the Egyptian empire was predicated upon its pre-Suez function as a trade route link between Asia and Europe via the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, overland caravan to the Nile, and then waterborne to Alexandria or via Somaliland, overland to the headquarters of the Nile, and thence to Alexandria. The latter route was not economically competitive, but was the route of travel of the ship designing and building arts that in due course brought the stoutly keeled, heavily ribbed, big-bellied ships into the Mediterranean. We have seen the Greek Alexander the Great crossing Persia and reaching the Indian Ocean, thus connecting with the Phoenician trading to Asia. 1,000 years later, the Crusaders, ostensibly fighting for holy reasons, were the Indian Ocean, Phoenician, Venetian, Viking, waterborne power structure, fighting the older overland Khyber Pass power structure over mastery of the trade route between Asia and Europe. In our Humans in Universe chapter, we spoke about the 600 to 200 BC Greeks' discovery that our Earth is a sphere and a planet of the solar system. This was the typical scientific product of a water navigation people. We witnessed also the originally horse-mounted Roman Empire's destruction of such knowledge as their earlier grand strategy sought to re-establish the Asia to Europe trade patterns via Constantinople and the inland overland Khyber Pass route. This explains why the power structure saw fit to dark age out the mariner's spherical concept. It explains Ptolemy's 200 AD conic maps cutting off the around Africa route mapped by the Eratosthenes 400 years earlier. With the world 3/4 water, the bigger ship producing capability was the beginning of a complete change in the control of human affairs. Bigger and better engineering was developed. The rival power structures were focused on the water supply lines. The Romans' overland road to England became obsolete. The Phoenicians, sailing out through Gibraltar into the Atlantic, outperformed them. This shifted the battles among the world trade route power structures from on the land, popular visibility, to popularly unwitnessed seascape. Long years of great battles of the Corsairs, the pirates of the Barbary coast, and so forth were unwitnessed and unknown to the land people. Who the power structures might be became popularly invisible.
Let's pause right there just for a second.
Sure.
There is a map here on page, we saw it before, it's on page 36 of in the book here. And it shows this map of Eratosthenes. Eratosthenes. It's a kind of a unique little map where it shows that they understood the trade routes really, really well. and they warped, Aristophanes warped. I'm going to take the blur off my machine here so that the picture is a little bit better. This map warped Africa and the lands north and south, and he just wrote that trade route right through the center of that thing. This is so unique for me because in history, you know, when I studied history, it was like everything was round, nothing was in any kind of direct economic relationship. It was just one, you know, the Bronze Age, you know, went away and up came the Iron Age, you know, and it was, or vice versa, you know, and it was never really explained like this. But you can see how Africa's warped. See how Africa's warped around? It was like the world didn't need to understand the actual shape of the earth because they were just worried about the money going back and forth. I don't know, it's really unique. So if you have critical path, look on page 37 and you have that Eratosthenes' map in 200 BC, which is really quite interesting. Okay, good. Thanks for letting me break that in. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, but I think it shows one thing. It shows first the explorer going out and doing things in a way that is invisible, like the pirates at sea and all of these things. Then information is kept. That's where you have a development of what you call, you know, secrecy in information. It's not diffused as it ought to be. Therefore, it's captured by some people who take it now and develop the political, economic around it. And these people will hold on to that political, economic system and defend it until a new technology that developed again out of sight drives them out. Drive them out by people who come, you know, they are rendered obsolete. Let's just put it dynamically. They are rendered obsolete. And that prevail, a new stuff prevail. And this brings me again to Susan's type 1 and type 2 evolution. You remember that?
Yeah.
Type 1 evolution was things happen and people appropriate it for wrong reason and then exploit it. Type 2, where general principles actually prevail, but they only prevail for a while in terms of our behaviors. Therefore, you have those cycles. And another note that I wanted to put here is that history is always written by the power of the day. So when we say history is important, it's important to extend that you are able to be able to write it, to read it from a source that is less immediately concerned. And that's the why long history is important, in that long after the Roman Empire expired, then somebody can objectively write about the real motives of the stay of that empire. If you are in the action of the Roman Empire when it's still influent, well, you're going to read history as written by the scribes of the Roman Empire, and that is going to be their point of view. So to me, it's quite important, practically, be able to read history, but not only recent history, but going back long enough to be able to objectively decipher what were the things that were really at play, the forces that were really at play to shape things the way they were shaped. I'm through, Steve.
Okay, cool. I just, as I compare that map on the Eratosthenes' map of 200 BC, the way Africa is trimmed over and Australia is mentioned there, but it has no perspective because it had nothing to do with those trade lines. And then to see his other map here, figure 15 on page 71 that we just looked at, how Australia is there, and that waterway out of the Suez, out of the Red Sea, and going into the Indian Ocean. I don't know, it just, the way he looks at the transfer of these goods and money and energy. I think if I'd have had these maps, when I looked, the things I remember in school was the maps, was the pictures, like the Merrimack and the Monitor. I don't know if you guys know about that, but those are the first like metal ships. They were in the Civil War in America. And it was the pictures that I remember, right? So I don't know, these maps are just wonderful to me. Cool. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, we'll continue then.
Finally, bigger ships got out of the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic, around Africa to the Orient, and then around the world. Thus, those in the know rediscover that the world is a sphere and not an infinitely extended lateral plane. Great battles ensued, waged under the flags of England, France, and Spain, to determine who would become supreme master of the world's high seas line of supply. These great nations were simply the operating fronts of behind the scenes, vastly ambitious individuals who had become so effectively powerful because of their ability to remain invisible while operating behind the national scenery.
Wow.
Always their victories were in the name of some powerful sovereign-ruled country. The real power structures were always the invisible ones behind the visible sovereign powers. Because the building of superior fleets of ships involved a complex of materials to produce, not only the wooden hulls, but the metal fastenings and the iron anchors and chains and the fibre ropes and cloth sails, and because woods from many parts of the world excelled in various functions of hull, masts, spar, oars, etc., large money credits for foreign purchase of these and other critical supplies brought control of the sea enterprising into the hands of international bankers. The building of invisible world power structure controls operates in the following manner. Suppose you know how and have the ambition, vision, and daring to build one of these great ships. You have the mathematics. You have the positioning of numbers that enables you or your servants to calculate the engineering data governing the design of hulls, spars, rigging, etc., and all the other necessary calculations for the building of a ship capable of sailing all the way to the Orient and returning with the incredible treasures that you've learned from travellers are to be found there. One trip to the Orient and a safe return to Europe could make you a fortune. These are fabulous stories of treasures in the Orient to be cashed in if my ship comes in. The building of a ship required that you be so physically powerful, a fighting man, commanding so many other fighting men, as to have a large regiment of people under your control, that you must have the acknowledged power to command all the people in your nations who are carpenters to work on your ship, all your nation's metal workers to work on the fastenings, chain plates, chains and anchors of your ship, all those that can make rope and all the people who grow fibres for your rope. All the skilled people of the nation had to be employed in the building and outfitting of your ship. In addition, you had to command all the farmers who produced the food to feed not only themselves, but also to feed all those skilled people while they built the ship, and to feed all your army and all your court. So there was no way you could possibly produce one of these great ships unless you were very, very powerful. Even then, in building ships, there were many essential materials that you didn't have in your own nation, and so had to purchase from others. You also needed working cash, money to cope with any and all unforeseen events that could not be coped with by use of muscle or the sword. Money to trade with. It was at this stage of your enterprise that the banker entered into the equation of power. Up until 1500 BC, all money was cattle, lambs, goats, or pigs. Live money that was real life support wealth. Wealth you could actually eat. Steers were by far the biggest food animal, and so they were the highest denomination of money. The Phoenicians carried their cattle with them for trading, but these big creatures proved to be very cumbersome on long journeys, long voyages. There was the time when Crete was the headquarters of the big boat people and their new supreme weapons, the times of supply-controlled ship. Crete was called the Minoan civilization, the bull civilization, worshippers of the male fertility god. The pair of joined bull's horns symbolised that the particular ship carried real wealth traders, that there were cattle on board to be exchanged for local wealth items. The Norsemen, with their paired horn headdress, were the Phoenicians, Venetian Viking, spelled Viking but pronounced Viking by the Vikings. Phoenicians, Punicians, Puntits, Punic Wars, Punt, boat, the boat people. Pun in some African coloured languages means red, as in Red Sea. The Vikings were simply the northernmost European traders. The Vikings, Venetians, Frisians, Phoenicians, Portuguese were crossbreeding water world people. Graduating from carrying cattle along for trading in 1500 BC, the Phoenicians invented metal money, which they first formed into iron half rings that look like a pair of bull's horns. Many today mistake them for bracelets. Soon the traders found that those in previously unvisited foreign countries had no memory of the cattle on board trading days and didn't recognise the miniature iron bullhorn. If metal was being used for trading, then there were other kinds of metal they preferred trading with people. Silver, copper and gold were easy to judge by hefting and were more aesthetically pleasing than the forged iron bullhorn symbols. This soon brought metal coinage into the game of the world trading, and with the first coin bearing the image of the sovereign of the homeland of the Phoenicians. This switch to coinage occurred coincidentally at just about the same time as the great changeover from city-state dominance to line of supply dominance of the power structure group controlling most of world affairs. This was the time when the Phoenicians began trading with people of so many different languages that, in need of a means of recording the different word sounds made by people around the world, the Phoenicians invented phonetic spelling, Phoenician spelling, which pronounced each successive sound separately and invented letter symbols for each sound. With phonetic spelling, human written communication changed very much. From the visual metaphor concept writing of the Orient, accomplished with complex ideographs, several of which frequently experienced generalised cartoons, told the whole story visually. It was a big change from ideographs to the Phoenicians' phonetic spelling, wherein each letter is a single sound, having no meaning in itself, and whereby it took several sounds to make a whole word and many such words to make any sense or a sentence. This is the historical event that Ezra Pound says coincides with the Tower of Babel. Pound says that humanity was split into a babel of individually meaningless sounds while losing the conceptual symbols of whole ideas, powerful generalizations. You had to become an expert to understand the phonetic letter code. The spelling of words excluded a great many people from communicating, people who'd been doing so successfully with ideographs. This gradual...
I'd like to pause right there. Do you know that I had my minor in one of my minors at university was linguistics, and I studied phonetics and phonemics and never understood that the phonetics came from Phoenicia or phonemics came from Phoenicia. Never got that. This totally just blows my mind. What a great...
Actually,
yeah, go ahead.
Actually, not Phoenicia. Phoenicia means nothing. From trade, because it says here, Phoenicians are trade people.
Right.
So phonetics comes from trade.
Yeah.
The necessity to exchange meaningfully many different people.
And I got a minor in linguistics, and I had no idea that the root of that word came from trade, from the need to be able to translate these languages and be able to transfer money around to build these empires. Boggles my mind. I thank you for letting me interrupt, but it just blows my mind. I mean, to see the way he does maps and the idea that this map from Aristophanes, it is a two-dimensional plane. And that lends itself to a flat Earth concept.
Mm.
You don't need, we didn't need a sphere here because the universe existed laterally across that land and water. And, you know, the fact that it connects over on these ends, that wasn't discovered and it wasn't important because this is where the money and power was, right here. I don't know, just the whole paradigm is just blowing my mind, you guys. So
And
thank
what
you.
does it mean? What you've seen, what you've shown there, Steve? What does it
Mhm.
mean in terms of our principles, general principles? What does it mean?
Well, it means went from a flat Earth to a spherical Earth. He just talked about that 3 seconds ago.
It means locality, local.
Yeah,
That's what it means. So when you say local, you have put boundaries in order for you
yeah,
to see it in a bounded way
yeah,
and in a way that is utilitarian to you. So it makes it basically flat.
Yeah.
and really, you know, there's so much money being made here, and the gamble of connecting these two things by trying to sail around a world, even though everybody knew the world was round, it had no practical value because there's where all the money was, right? So for Columbus to sail out trying to find Asia and then bump into the North Americas, you know, to the American continents, it just boggles my mind. What a great,
And where was Columbus, Steve?
what's what?
Where was Columbus?
He left on Spain, so
No,
Portugal.
no, where was it on that map that you showed us?
He's over here.
He's at the border.
Yeah,
Remember, change comes always from the border.
yeah,
Most of the time, unbeknownst to people inside.
from the
Yeah.
boundary, the edge, right?
That is true.
Always, always. And that's the principle.
Yeah.
Change always comes from the border,
Yeah,
from the boundary.
From the
That's
boundary.
where change is happening. Because while people were trading and being comfortable within that map, there were explorers following a certain interest, a different ideas to say, hey, this is nice here, but maybe there's something different. Or somebody told a story before, let's check this story. Can we actually, as you say, connect east to west on that map without going inside the
Yeah.
contour? And that's where the secrecy of knowledge and the appropriation of power takes place. Because the surpluses that are gotten inside trading, some people funnel them to finance that exploration. And it's a principle that we know today in oil and everything, you know, what you call a phase of exploration, where some people have means to, most of the time, under the cover of secrecy, send explorers and fund them to expand the boundary of the knowledge, you know, the boundary of the universe. Let's just put it that way.
right on. Okay. I'm learning a lot, just different ways to look at the planet. So we're ready to continue?
Yep.
Yes.
I don't remember if we're at this.
Here we are. This gradual alteration of world trading devices from cattle to gold brought about the world around development of pirates who, building small but swift craft, could on a dark night board one of the great merchant ships just before it reached home, richly laden after a 2-year trip to the Orient, and take over the ship and above all its gold. With the gold captured, the pirates often burned the vanquished ship. As already mentioned in our introduction, It was in 1805, 200 years after the founding of the East India Company, that the British won the Battle of Trafalgar, giving them dominance of all the world's lines of supply. They now controlled the seas of the world. It was said by world people that the British Empire became the first empire in history upon which the sun never set. In order to get their gold off the sea and out of reach of the pirates, the British made deals with the sovereigns of all the countries around the world with whom they traded, by which it was agreed from then on to keep annual accounts of their intertrading, and at the end of the year to move the gold from the debtors' bank in London to the creditors' bank in London to balance the accounts. In this way, they kept the gold off the ocean and immune to sea pirate raiding. This brought about what is now called the balance of trade accounting. The international trading became the most profitable of all enterprises, and great landowners with clear-cut king's deeds to their land often went to international gold moneylenders. The great land barons underwrote the building of enterprises' ships with their cattle or other real wealth, the regenerative products of their lands turned over to the lender as collateral. If the ship did come back, both the enterpriser and the bankers realised a great gain. The successful ship venturer paid the banker back, and the banker who had been holding the cattle as collateral returned them to their original proprietor. But during the voyage, usually 2 years to the Orient and back to Europe, the pledged cattle had calves, kind, German for child. And this is where the concept of interest originated, which was payable in kind. The cattle that were born while the collateral was held by the banker were to belong to the banker. When the Phoenicians shifted their trading strategy from carrying cattle to carrying metal money, the metal money didn't have little money, kind, but the idea of earned interest persisted. This meant that the interest was deducted from the original money value, and this, of course, depreciated the capital equity of the borrower. This metallic equity banking became a different kind of game from the original concept. In 20th century banking, the depositors assume that their money is safely guarded in the vaulted banks, especially so in a savings bank, whereas their money is loaned out within seconds after it is deposited at interest payable to the banker, which is greater than the interest paid to the savings account depositor. And since the metal or money or paper money does not produce children, kind, the banker's so-called earned share must in reality be deducted from the depositor's true wealth deposit. The merchant bankers of Venice came to underwrite the Phoenicians' voyaging ventures. Such international trade financing swiftly became the big thing in the banking game. The merchant of Venice, Shylock and his pound of flesh forfeit of the debtor, was Shakespeare's way of calling attention to the fact that the banker's interest was in reality depleting the life support equity of both the depositors and the borrowers. It was the financing of such international voyaging, trading and individual travel, as well as of vaster games of governmental takeovers, that built the enormous wealth-controlled fortunes of early European private banking families. It was under analogous circumstances of financing inter-American European trade that in the late 19th century, J.P. Morgan became a man of great power. By having his banking houses in Paris and London, Philadelphia and New York, he was able not only to finance people's foreign travel, all their intershipment of goods and to give letters of credit, but also to finance and control major new era railroading, shipbuilding, mining, manufacturing and energy generating enterprises in general. Such powerful banking gave insights regarding the degrees of risk that could be taken. The people doing the risking came to the banker for advice. In such a manner, J.P. Morgan developed the most powerful financing position in America, as society went from wooden ships to steel ships and the concomitant iron mining, blast furnace building, and steel rolling mill development, as well as the making of boilers and engines, electric generators and air conditioning system. To better understand the coming of world power structure into North American affairs, we will switch back from the 19th to the 17th and 18th centuries to the opening up of North America and the American socio-economic scene. The European colonisation occurred in several major ways. The Spanish way was accomplished with vast haciendas, grants from the king to powerful supporters. The hacienda development began in Central America and Mexico and expanded northward into California. The British king also gave vast plantation grants to royal favourites on the North American southeastern coast below the freezing line. The French came to two parts of North America, one the Gulf of Mexico, Mississippi Delta, where exiled prisoners were dumped, and two to the St. Lawrence area of Canada, where they moved westward via the Great Lakes, then southward on the Mississippi to join with those lower Mississippi colonists exploring northward and westward on the Mississippi.
Let me pause right there. As an American studying history, I never realized that the French who moved into Quebec, Toronto, and moved west from there, and they were hooked around into the Louisiana territory. I never got that. I never got that the United States, the colonies were surrounded by French. I never got that until this moment. I knew about the Louisiana Purchase and the fact that the French, in fact, in real estate, we understand that the parishes in Louisiana were based on French law, and there's still a lot of common law French law going on in Louisiana in those states. And it's different than Massachusetts and Virginia, which have common law that came from Britain. And then out here in the West, this is kind of like the culmination of everything and the streamlining of everything. But I never understood that the French wrapped around the colonies like that until this very moment. Isn't that interesting? Maybe I'm just dumb, but this was another epiphany for me. Okay, I'm complete. Any other thoughts? Okay, good.
We're up to British sovereign grants, aren't we?
I think so.
Yep. British sovereign grants were also being given on the northeastern coast, where it was much colder and where existence was much more difficult. Because it was much more difficult to colonise, the royal favourites who received large land grants from the British king in the north did everything they could to encourage colonisation of any kind by others who bought their land from their landlords. The Pilgrims and other people of religious conviction found the freedom of thought and act to warrant hazarding their lives in the cold winter wilderness. On the northeast coast of North America, the individuals who did the colonising were not the landowners who remained safely in Europe. In the south, the royal favourite landowners themselves occupied and personally operated many of the great plantations. Though motivated by distinctly different northern and southern reasons for doing so, we have the East Coast North American British blood people breaking away from the old world through the American Revolution. In our tracing of the now completely invisible world power structures, it is important to note that while the British Empire as a world government lost the American Revolution, the power structure behind it did not lose the war. The most visible of the power structure identities was the East India Company, an entirely private enterprise whose flag, as adopted by Queen Elizabeth in 1600, happened to have 13 red and white horizontal stripes with a blue rectangle in its upper left-hand corner. The blue rectangle bore in red and white the superimposed crosses of St. Andrew and St. George. When the Boston Tea Party occurred, the colonists dressed as Indians boarded the East India Company's 3 ships and threw overboard their entire cargoes of high-tax tea. They also took the flag from the masthead of the largest of the East Indiamen, the Dartmouth. George Washington took command of the US Continental Army under an elm tree in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The flag used for that occasion was the East India Company's flag, which by pure coincidence had 13 red and white stripes. Though it was only coincidence, most of those present thought the 13 red and white stripes did represent the 13 American colonies, ergo was very appropriate. But they complained about the included British flag superimposed crosses in the blue rectangle in the top corner. George Washington conferred with Betsy Ross, after which the 13 white 5-pointed stars in the blue field with the 13 red and white horizontal stripes. Oh, yeah, okay. George Washington conferred a better. While the British government lost the 1776 war, the East India Company's owners, who constituted the invisible power structure behind the British government, not only did not lose, but move right into the new USA economy, along with the latter's most powerful landowners. By pure chance, I happened to uncover this popularly unknown episode of American history, commissioned in 1970 by the Indian government to design new airports in Bombay, New Delhi and Madras. I was visiting the Grand Palace of the British forces in Madras, where the English first established themselves in India in 1600. There I saw a picture of Queen Elizabeth I and the flag of the East India Company of 1600 AD, with its 13 red and white horizontal stripes and its superimposed crosses in the upper corner. What astonished me was that this flag, which seemed to be the American flag, was apparently being used in 1600 AD, 175 years before the American Revolution. Displayed on the stairway landing, together with the portrait of Queen Elizabeth I painted on canvas, the flag was painted on the wall itself, as was the seal of the East India Company. The supreme leaders of the American Revolution were of the Southern type, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Both were great landowners with direct royal grants for their lands, in contradistinction to the relatively meagre individual land holdings of the individual Northern Puritan colonists. With the Revolution over, we have Alexander Hamilton arguing before the Congress that it was not the intention of the signers of the Declaration of Independence that the nation so formed should have any wealth. Wealth, Hamilton argued, as supported by Adam Smith, is the land, which is something that belonged entirely to private individuals, predominantly the great landowners with king-granted deeds to hundreds and sometimes thousands of square miles, as contrasted to the ordinary colonists' few hundreds of acres of homestead farms.
Let's pause there just for a second.
Wow.
Recently, what's that?
Just, yeah,
Yeah, there's a lot going on there, isn't there?
what a con job.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Have you guys seen the Alexander Hamilton? Have you guys seen that rap? It's a
No.
Broadway play it's all done in rap, black rap music, and it's done with black actors, and it's talking about all this and how Hamilton tried to set up a banking system and the conflict that went off between those guys and all the inner machinations. And in one of the major themes of the play Hamilton is the room where it happened, and that's a major cool tune. The room where it happened. The room where it happened. My daughters went back to. They were back east in New York, and they went out in the countryside, and they actually stood in the room where it happened. Hamilton did this big shenanigan negotiation about and talking about this very thing. I wish I understood the play better right now, because I'd love to compare the history, the way it's taught, and the way that Bucky is talking about it here. So anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting.
But
Okay, I'm complete.
yeah,
Mm.
what I find very interesting here is that it's always about interest.
Yeah.
Everything is always about big interest, having the means to either fool or coerce the masses into action that seem legitimately justified, but actually preserve their interests. In the case, the case here being that of American Revolution, big business won on both sides. In other words, it's like you control the big pie, and then you divide the pie into two, and you set them to fight. They will fight, but you will be, every gain that is locally recorded there will belong to you. And this is something that is very important to me in understanding what, what went on then and what is going on today.
Mm.
It's always important to take a step back, really. What we say, we've been calling waiting in the lag, and observe things in order to allow your emotions to kind of stabilize before you attempt to make any opinion on something that is important. It is, to me, very, very kind of educative.
I think the play Hamilton is on Disney Plus, and I think I'm going to go back and watch it again, because we're going to continue on with Hamilton and the banking system here. So the history is amazing to me.
Mm.
Okay, we ready to go?
Yep. Hamilton went on to argue that the United States government, so formed, would of course need money from time to time and must borrow that money from the rich landowners' banks and must pay the banks back with interest, assuming that the people would be benefited by what their representative government did with the money it borrowed. The people gladly would be taxed in order to pay the money back to the landowners with interest. This is where a century-and-a-half-long game of wealth poker began, with the cards dealt only to the great landowners by the world power structure. Obviously, very powerful people had their land given to them by the king and not by God, but the king, with the church's approbation, asserted it was with God's blessing. This deed processing produced a vast number of court decisions and legal precedents based on centuries and centuries of deed inheritances. Thus, landlords' deeds evolved from deeds originally dispensed from deeds of war. Then the great landlords loaned parcels of their lands to sharecropping farmers who had to pay the landlord a tithe or rent and interest out of the wealth produced by nature within the confines of the deeded land. The landlord had his tithing barn within which to store the grains collected in the baskets. Fiscus is Latin for basket. Thus, the fiscal year is that which winds up with the basketed measuring of the net grains harvested. The real payoff, of course, was in regenerative metabolic increments of the botanical photosynthetic impoundment of nature of sun radiation and hydrocarbon molecules structuring and proliferation through other hydrogenic and biological interaccommodations.
Yeah.
Obviously, none of this natural wealth generating and multiplying process was accreditable to the landlords. When I was young, there were people whom everybody knew to be very wealthy. Nobody had the slightest idea of what that wealth consisted other than the visible land and the complex of buildings in which the wealthy lived, plus their horses, carriages, and yachts. The only thing that counted was that they were known to be enormously wealthy. The wealthy could do approximately anything they wanted to do. Many owned cargo ships. However, the richest were often prone to live in a very unostentatious way. Of course, money was coined and the paper equivalents of metallic coinage were issued by the officers of banks of variously ventured private capital banking type land systems. Enterprises were underwritten by wealthy landowners to whom shares in the enterprise were issued, and when fortunate, dividends were paid. Rich people sometimes had their own private banks. See, I lost track. Okay. Where are we? Dividends were paid. Rich people sometimes had their own private banks, as for instance, JP Morgan and Company. Ordinary people rushed to deposit their earnings in the wealthy people's banks. For all the foregoing reasons, nobody knew of what the wealth of the wealthy really consisted, nor how much there was of it. There were no income taxes until after World War I, but the income tax did not disclose capital wealth. It disclosed only the declared income of the wealthy. The banks were capitalised in various substantial amounts, considered obviously adequate to cover any and all deposits by other than the bankers involved in proclaiming the capital values. These capital values were agreed upon privately between great landowners based on equities well within the marketable values of small fractions of their vast king-deeded land holdings. I need you to excuse me for a couple of minutes. Just got to check on something.
Wow. Steve, I can't hear you. You are mute.
I just was wondering if anybody had any epiphanies to share from this.
I mean, so far, if I'm really want to share, it has to do with the supply chain actually, and how it transformed local communities, and how changes actually it made or on the border essentially. And that's something that there's a book called Geography of Genius, and it's talks about how when people become more local and close down their borders, that they become less innovative. And anyway, that's just a thought.
Let me
Yeah.
make this comment. It took me 20 years to relate Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, and especially Shylock's Pound of Flesh, to economics and interest.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was the same for you. When I read it, when we studied it, it was just a play.
Right.
Yeah.
It didn't mean anything to me. You know, there was not even a hint of anything to do with interest and with money.
Yeah.
It was just
What?
understood as somebody being cupid, somebody being stingy and very exigent.
Yeah.
And Venice was like one of those first ghettos actually where they made those trades, where they were able to make those trades.
Yeah.
Because Christianity wouldn't allow for interest.
But the value for me today is that education, formal education that we receive, avoid these things very, very objectively. They avoid them. You will be PhD of something without ever knowing anything like this.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is again on the individual to first become aware, then conscious, then make a decision and take action. And the first action is that of being a lifelong student of life. Does it mean anything what I'm saying? Lifelong student of, I don't know, of something. Of
It's a
real
matter of
life.
survival.
Yeah.
It's a matter of survival.
Yeah, you need to understand, to understand this thing. If you don't, you're not going to understand things. You are going to stay at the first degree. And that is the first degree of emotions. You've never been able to detach enough to intellectually reason on things that are perceived in order to kind of discern their intimate and real meaning, and what are the forces that are at play. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like anything that we see is just a masquerade. I'm talking about, if, it's just your sight, what you see, and your interpretation of what you see very often is deceptive, right?
Yeah.
Or it's very incomplete.
Yeah. Well, that's
You
what
have
he's
to put,
beginning here.
you have to put in what you feel and what you experience And what is the succession of feeling, of experience to really make sense? In other words, you have to build history, and building history means accumulating energy into something to see you make substance, because substance is energy. Did you build a structure that contained that energy without leaking it in order to preserve the pattern of your interpretation?
Yeah.
And that's the test of any idea.
Yeah, the idea of what is wealth and the fact that nobody really knew how wealthy people were at this time. And the very idea that after World War there was income tax, which gave people an idea of how much income the wealthy were making on their assets, but there's still no declaration of the value of capital assets. He's going to continue to explain this down here, but this progression is blowing my mind. How
And it's
practical.
interesting. Sorry about that. My wife's away this weekend, and I had washing on the line. I suddenly realised it was raining outside. I had to run out and bring the washing off the line.
Well, good for you.
But there is a proposal in Australia at the moment, I believe, to establish a register of the ultimate ownership of all assets, all land. The true owner behind it would be a matter of public record. Now, that's a pretty frightening concept for a whole lot of reasons. And we have a Labor government in Australia, a federal Labor government. And I believe that within the next few years, we'll have death duties again. Australia at the moment doesn't have any death duties, but I believe we'll have death duties again. This whole thing of the nature of wealth, the knowledge of wealth, the disclosure of wealth, because what's likely to happen if I was incredibly wealthy, I wouldn't want people to know that I was the ultimate controller or owner of every asset that I did control or own. People use companies, trusts, and other structures to conceal that.
Yeah.
I might well decide to leave the country, because once that's a matter of public record, anybody can find out who owns and controls everything. That's anathema to the status quo.
Are you saying that you might leave, or there are those?
No, I wouldn't, but I'm saying the truly wealthy.
Yeah.
If you're a billionaire, do you want everybody to know that you're the true ultimate owner of that house, that factory, that property, that property?
Yeah. And of course, people use trusts, as you said, John. They also use LLCs. One of our big issues now in America is that since the 80s, when we first had this first savings and loans crisis, and then we came into the crash of 2008, hedge funds were given permission because of the Glass-Steagall law was taken out. Hedge funds,
Which should never have happened. Should never have happened.
Should never have happened. Hedge funds and banks can now own commodities, which means that hedge funds and banks can now own real estate. One of the problems in America today is that hedge funds pay too much for the real estate, and then they hang on to it, and then they raise the freaking rents. And right now in America, there is no way to know how much of the rental real estate is owned by hedge funds because of trusts and because of LLCs, and there are all these ways to hide where the ownership is. But that's one of our problems right now is the wealth.
Some of the financial advisors I deal with tell me that the US is heading for a major recession.
Yeah.
It actually looks reasonably good. In fact, it looks too good.
Yeah.
But it's built on unsound foundations.
Yeah.
And those sorts of things. The removal of Glass-Steagall was a huge mistake. I mean, the wealth that's been stolen from people by the various financial crises, 2008, the global financial crisis, and since then. Yeah. I mean, and you've got different laws because you have debt on real estate that is non-recourse. The only recourse is against the real estate. In Australia, you personally are liable. So if the property becomes worth less than the debt, not only do you lose the property, but you're personally liable, you're bankrupt.
Well,
You are liable
interestingly,
for the whole debt.
yeah,
Okay, but
interestingly, in America, though, the non-recourse debt is negotiated. In other words, when the average home buyer goes out to buy, it's total recourse. The average consumer has recourse debt all the way down the line. The only time when non-recourse debt, and in fact, a lot of people don't understand non-recourse debt in America. And I've been teaching since 1975. I've been teaching people how to set up contracts and buy properties with non-recourse loans. Most people never think to put that in the stupid agreement. And they are required with IRA accounts in America. I don't know if this is a phenomenon that's only in America, but because an IRA account is a trust and it's a retirement fund set up for future income, it's a trust. If I cannot get any personal benefit from my IRA account, so I don't know how it works in Australia or if you even have them.
Sounds a bit like superannuation.
It's what, like what?
Sounds a bit like superannuation.
I don't know that word.
Okay, so
that's the same as
your employer must deduct from your income a proportion and contribute it to superannuation. There are large insurance companies and finance companies that manage superannuation funds, and in fact, the unions that represent the workers have got into them, and they control trillions of dollars.
Yeah, you're calling them superannuation?
Mm-hmm.
Superannuation.
Okay, I've never.
SUP. Superannuation is the equivalent of our what are they? 401k funds.
Yeah, we have
Oh,
401ks
okay.
and we have IRAs, and those are trusts. And so I can't go into a bank and say, well, I have $1 million in my IRA account and have it count for me personally, because that would
Same
be
with our superannuation, same thing.
very good. And if I own property in my retirement fund, the loans have to be non-recourse, because so loans on IRA properties are at 50% LTV usually, maybe as high as 60%, maybe as high as 70%, but generally speaking, their 50% LTV loans are non-recourse loans. But anytime when I'm negotiating with another business person, I can say, okay, I'll buy your business and I'll pay you $1 million and it'll be non-recourse. And that could be negotiated, and it's legal to negotiate that into a mortgage or into a debt between private parties. But banks in America, 99.9% of the business is recourse, full recourse. And one of the big issues was when the crash came in 2008, the banks started repossessing properties. The Congress passed a law, because in America, debt relief is taxable. So if I have a $200,000 loan on a property and I go bankrupt, I still got to pay taxes on if the value of the property drops, I have to pay tax. If the bank sells that property at an auction, and let's say there's a $200,000 loan and they only sell it for 100 grand, the bank can come at me for the 100 grand as full recourse, and I'm taxed on it as debt relief. It's as though I received income in America.
So you know what it means, Steve? It means that debt is not depreciable.
Yeah.
Debt is forgivable. You understand, Bernie?
Is for what?
Yeah,
Take
that's a
things.
good deal.
You issue a bond or a mortgage.
Okay.
That mortgage is purchased for by a lender. The value of that mortgage is fixed. Is fixed. You have to repay it.
Yeah, the
Not
principal
something that, hold on.
value is set, and that principal value is due and fixed, right?
Yes. So that principal value, the only way that it can be reduced over time is through forgiveness. It is not depreciable as an asset would be. You get what I'm saying? So there's no value, there's no depreciation, there's no expense of value for operation of debt.
The interest is deductible.
No, I mean, I don't care. I'm saying the value, if the value of debt. If you owe me,
The face value of the debt.
yes, the principal of the debt.
Yes.
If we have an agreement and I
Right.
lend you money,
Right.
you are obliged, whatever your conditions, to
Right.
repay me that.
Yeah.
The only way that can change is for me to forgive you. Otherwise, you have to abide by the repayment, the principal, and all the interest attached to it. There's no other way.
Yeah.
Whereas the collateral, I mean the equivalent, the dual of it, which is the real asset, the value of it, yo-yos. And you find a way to balance the book. You call equity. You say I build equity into this. But equity is something that is very ethereal. It's there today, tomorrow is not there. Until you realize it fully by fully repaying the loan. But if the system is made of loan over loan, refinancing all the time, and people don't even know what it is, well, you even know how to define what you call wealth. Is wealth is accumulation of debt, where you are on one side, and when you are a debtor is a problem. It can be over a certain limit is a big problem. Because debt completely ignores the realities of the economic functioning. You know, when you see the point I'm trying to say that debt is not compressible until it is forgiven.
Until it's
I
paid.
lend you money. I'm a banker. I lend Steve money to do
Yeah.
some venture.
Right.
Right? We have
Right.
a covenant that you are going to pay me this and that in principle,
Right.
amortization, and in interest.
Yeah.
I don't care about what the functioning, the risk that you're taking is your risk.
Because you're the bank.
It's up to you. Yeah, the onus is on you.
Yeah.
You repay me according to these fixed terms.
Right.
So if you don't pay, I don't care. It's easier for me to collect.
Yeah.
That's why in America, for example, you guys are strict in such a way that landowners, they call it the leasehold, right? You call it leasehold, right? People who own land, how do you call it?
They're landowners or
Not
owners.
leaseholders.
It's land ownership.
Yes. It's more valuable to own the land than the buildings.
Based on the market value of the land, which can be artificially adjusted. When we talk more, I've written books on this. This is my business of consulting people. I tell people how to set up mortgages, and most people don't know that a bank can issue a loan, let's say at 4%. And when the interest rate rises to 6%, the bank can sell that loan to another bank for profit. And most people don't understand how mortgages are actually assets. And it's quite complicated, but they're like, everything you're saying is true, Manu, under a strict construct of circumstances. But when market values tend to adjust, and then when banks start to deal with each other, those loans are assets. And based on the premium, the interest rate, there are premiums, millions of dollars. What a loan can be issued for 200 grand, and over the next 2 or 3 years, banks can make another 200 grand based on the interest rate at the time and the value of that asset based on the current interest rate. So it's very complicated, and it's a great source of income. I used to teach people how to buy notes at a discount. Wayne
but Steve,
yeah,
just the catch there is this one. I'm the original borrower, right?
okay,
You are the banker. You trade my mortgage
right,
money.
yeah,
It does not take the obligation, the original obligation from me.
it does not. You're absolutely correct. However,
And that's the key. That's the key.
well,
It
another
does
key
not.
is that, let's
So,
say
so individually, the borrower, I'm still obligated, whatever profit you make.
right,
And that was actually what the Glass-Steagall was meant for, to put that separation between the trading and the lending, the normal lending on banks.
Yes, it was to
And-
stop banks gambling.
Yes, because trading is
Withdraw money.
gambling.
There are
Yes.
other aspects of this that are not gambling. Let's say that you
Yeah.
come to me and you borrow money from me at rate, let's say 3%. And now their interest rate rises to 6%. I can sell that note to John for more than the face value on the note.
I think you're the wrong way round, Steve. If I've got a note that pays 6% and the rates drop, then it's
I can
worth
sell it, yes.
more than the
Okay.
face value. If the return increases, then the asset will become more valuable than its face value.
And I was thinking of another model. So we're understanding the concepts here. One of the great things I used to teach people is how they could buy a note at a discount
Yeah.
and then go back to the borrower and renegotiate a payment, double the borrower's payment and drop the interest rate, and at the same time, counterintuitively, double or triple my yield on the note. So
Hmm.
I'm just
Steve,
thinking
how
about-
does that attach to the satisfaction of the need for shelter when buying a house?
the
Because
satisfaction.
what you are saying there, okay, you're teaching people to do this and that. That becomes pretty complicated to your student.
That's why they pay me money.
Exactly. But they are paying you money and they are paying the banker and then paying, like in the end, is uneducated. And that is really dramatic. That's why the result
In
is
the
what
end,
we
it's
have.
what? In the end, it's what?
He is uneducated, still uneducated. The guy just wanted to have a house to live.
Dude, I can show you
I'm-
that transaction I just said, and everybody wins in the transaction. Everybody wins. The guy who raises his payment and gets his interest rate lowered, he wins. Everybody wins in that transaction.
I haven't said so, Steve. I'm not talking about the small individual. I'm talking about
I'm talking about small.
overall function
talking about
of
small
housing
I think he
provision.
meant smart, not small.
Yeah, it becomes very complicated for the ordinary guy, isn't
Oh,
it?
it's complicated
The
for the
game of
ordinary
debt.
guy. But it's very simple. And once one learns that skill, it's like riding a bike. And that one of the things, I don't know, so maybe it might be worthwhile for me to present a thing about note buying and banks and how everybody wins when you start using market rates and as market rates adjust. This is like the little guy investing in the stock market and being able to win, because the stock market moves based on big bucks, and the little guy can say, okay, we're starting to see an uptrend here, and buy in as the uptrend goes up, and then say, okay, I'm going to see a downtrend in, and sell before the downtrend occurs. And then every time it drops, buy again, because it's going to go up again. A lot of
It
people call
requires a lot of education, Steve. It requires a lot of education and dexterity. How
Well,
many people
what I
are
teach.
traders? How
I
many?
don't think it's a lot of education, but if you want to
Oh.
say so, I'll take the compliment.
Okay, yes. I'm just saying, how many people, if you look at all what is around there around trading,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If you take a population of 1,000 or 100 that engage into trading activities, how many of the 100 really make profit consistently to living?
If you know the rules and play the rules, you'll make the profit, just like anybody can go in the stock market. This is based on these same principles as here. The problem is that the wealthy people understand these things and take advantage of it, where the average person says, I don't care who owns all that wealth. I just want a place to live, right? So the average American trounced off into Oklahoma and took 4 acres of ground and said, this is my, they were giving away land at some point to get people to move out of the east and move across the west so they could take the land away from the Indians. But unless they had people move, they couldn't get that to happen. So they started giving away land. Here it talks about how the king gave the land to the rich guys, and the rich guys hold on to the land, and then let people farm it. But there are other aspects of this too. So good.
Let's continue.
All right.
But
I think we're at the rich get richer, John.
Yes, the rich get richer and the poor get children was a popular song of the early 1920s. Wages were incredibly low, and the rich could get their buildings built for a song, and people them with many servants for another song. But as with uncalled poker hands, nobody ever knew what the wealthy really had. I was a boy in a comfortably off family, not a wealthy family, not wealthy enough to buy and own horses and carriages. To me, the wealthy seemed to be just fantastically so. This brings us to World War I. Why was it called the First World War? All wars until this time had been fought in the era when land was the primary wealth. The land was the wealth because it produced the food essential to life. In the land wealth era of warring, the opposing forces took the farmers from the farms and made soldiers of them. They exhausted the farm-produced food supplies and trampled down the farms. War was local. In 1810, only 5 years after Malthus's pronouncement of the fundamental inadequacy of life support on planet Earth, the telegraph was invented. It used copper wires to carry its message. This was the beginning of a new age of advancing technology. The applied findings of wealth brought about an era in which there was a great increase of metals being interalloyed or interemployed, mechanically, chemically, and electrolytically. Metals greatly increased the effectiveness of the land-produced foods. The development of non-rusting, hermetically sealed tin cans made possible preservation and distribution of foods to all inhabited portions of our planet Earth. All the new technology of all the advancing industry, which was inaugurated by the production of steel in the mid-19th century, required the use of all the known primary metallic elements in various intercomplementary alloyings. For instance, tin cans involve tin from the Malay Straits, iron from West Virginia mines, and manganese from southern Russia. The metals were rarely found under the farmlands or in the lands that belonged to the old lords of the food productive lands. Metals were found, often, but not always, in mountains all around the world, in lands of countries remote from one another. Mine ownerships were granted by the governments to the first to file claims. It was the high seas, intercontinental, international trafficking in these metals that made possible the life support effectiveness of both farming and fishing. The high seas trafficking was mastered by the world-around line of supply controllers, the venturers and pirates known collectively as the British Empire. This world-around traffic was in turn financed, accounted and maximally profited in by the international bankers and their letters of credit, bills of exchange, and similar pieces of paper. International banking greatly reduced the necessity for businessmen to travel with their exported goods to collect at the importer's end. Because the world around occurring metals were at the heart of this advance in standards of living for increasing numbers of humans all around the world, the struggle for mastery of this trade by the invisible, behind-the-scenes contending world power structures ultimately brought about the break of the visible International World War I. The war was the consequence of the world power structure outs becoming realistically ambitious to take away from the British ins the control of the world's high seas lines of supply. The outs saw that the British Navy was guarding only the surface of the sea and that there were proven new inventions, the submarine, which could go under the water, and the aeroplane, which could fly above the water. So the behind-the-scenes world power structure outs adopted their multi-dimensional offensive strategy against the two-dimensional world power structure ins. The invisible power structure outs puppeted the Germans and their allies. The invisible power structure ins puppeted Great Britain and her allies. With their underwater strategies, the outs did severely break down the ins line of supply. JP Morgan was the visible fiscal agent for the in power structure operating through Great Britain and her allies. The 1914 industrial productivity in America was enormous, with an even more enormous amount of untapped US metallic resources, particularly of iron and copper, as backup. Throughout the 19th century, all the contending invisible world power structures invested heavily in the USA enterprise equities. Throughout the 19th century, the vast resources of the USA, plus the new array of imported European industrial tooling, the North American economy established productivity. The USA economy took all the industrial machinery that had been invented in England, Germany, France, and Europe in general, and reproduced it in America with obvious experience-suggested improvements. In 1914, World War I started in the Balkans and was joined in Belgium and France on the European continent. The British Isles represented the unsinkable flagship of the high seas navy of the masters of the world, oceans, lines of supply. The unsinkable flagship commanded the harbours of the European customers of the high seas line of supply control. If the line of supply that kept the war joined on the European continent broke down completely, then the Outs would be able to take the British Isles themselves, which, as the flagship of the Inns, would mean the latter's defeat. In 1914, 3 years before the USA ended the war, J.P. Morgan, as the Allies' fiscal agent, began to buy in the USA to offset the line of supply losses accomplished by the enemy submarines. Morgan kept buying and buying, but finally, on the basis of sound world banking finance, which was predicated on the available gold reserve, came the point at which Morgan had bought for the British and their allies an amount of goods from the USA, equaling all the monetary bullion gold in the world available to the Inns power structure. Despite this historically unprecedented magnitude of the Allied purchasing, it had only fractionally tapped the productivity of the USA. So Morgan, buying on behalf of England and her allies, exercised their borrowing credit to an extent that bought a total of goods worth twice the amount of gold and silver in the world available to the Inns. As yet, the potential productivity of the USA was but fractionally articulated. Because the ability to pay later credit of the Allied nations could not be stretched any further, the only way to keep the USA productivity flowing and increasing was to get the USA itself into the war on the inside, so that it would buy its own productivity in support of its own war effort, as well as that of its allies. By skillful psychology and propaganda, the Inns persuaded America that they were fighting to save democracy. I recall as one of the youth of those times how enthusiastic everybody became about saving democracy. Immediately, the USA government asked the British and their allies, "What do you need over there?" The Inns replied, 1 million trained and armed men, and the ships to carry them to France, and many, many new ships to replace the ships that have been sunk by submarines. We'd need them desperately to keep carrying the tanks and aeroplanes, weapons and munitions to France. The Inns also urgently requested that the US Navy be increased in strength to equal the strength of the British Navy and therewith to cope with the German submarines. While our British Navy keeps the German high seas fleet bottled up, we want all of this from America. America went to work, took over and newly implemented many of the USA industries, such as the telephone, telegraph and power companies, and produced all that was wanted. For the first time in history, from 1914 to 1918, humanity entered into a comprehensive program of industrial transformation and went from wire to wireless communications, from track to trackless transportation, from two-dimensional transport to four-dimensional transport, from visible structuring and mechanical techniques to invisible atomic and molecular structuring and mechanics. Within 1 year, the 1 million armed and trained USA soldiers were safely transported to France without the loss of one soldier to the submarines. Arrived in France, they entered the line of battle. With the line of supply once more powerfully re-established by the US Navy and its merchant fleet, it became clear that the Inns were soon going to win. J.P. Morgan, now representing the Allied power structure, capitalist systems, banks, as well as serving as the Allies' purchasing agent, said to the American Congress, "How are we going to pay for it all?" The American Congress said, "What do you mean pay for it? This is our own wealth. This is our war to save democracy. We will win the war and then stop the armaments production." Morgan said, "You have forgotten Alexander Hamilton. The US government doesn't have any money. you're going to pay for it all right, but since you don't have any money, you're going to have to borrow it from the banks. You're going to borrow from me, Mr. Morgan, in order to pay these vast war bills. Then you must raise the money by taxes to pay me back. To finance these enormous payments, Mr. Morgan and his army of lawyers invented for the US government the Liberty Loans and Victory Loans. Then the US Congress invented the income tax. With the US Congress's formulating of the legislation that set up the scheme of the annual income tax, we, the people, had for the first time a little peek into the poker hands of the wealthy, but only into the amount of their taxable income, not into the principal wealth cards of their poker game. During World War I, US industrial production had gone to 178 billion. With only 30 billion of monetary gold in the world, this monetary magnitude greatly exceeded any previously experienced controllability of the behind-the-scenes finance power of the European allies. World War I over, won by the Allies, all the countries on both sides of the warring are deeply in debt. Because the debt to the USA was twice that of all the gold in the INS world, all the countries involved in World War I paid all their gold to the USA. Despite these enormous payments in gold, all the countries were as yet deeply indebted in debt to the USA. Thereafter, all those countries went off the gold standard. All the monetary gold bullion paid to the USA was stored in the mountain vaults of Fort Knox, Kentucky. International trade became completely immobilised, and the USA found itself having unwittingly become the world's new financial master. Swiftly, it arranged vast trading account loans to the foreign countries. This financing of foreign countries, purchased by the USA credit loans, started an import-export boom in the USA, followed by an early 1920s recession, another boom, then the Great Crash of 1929. The reasons for the Great Crash go back to the swift technological evolution occurring in the USA between 1900 and the 1914 beginning of World War I, and the USA's entry into it in 1917. Most important amongst those techno-economic evolution events are those relating to electrical power. Gold is the most efficient conductor of electricity, silver is the next, and copper is a close third. Of these three, gold is the scarcest, silver next, then copper. Though relatively scarce, copper is the most plentiful of the good electrical conductors. Copper is also non-sparking and therefore makes a safe casing for gunpowder-backed bullets and big gun shells. As a consequence of these conditions, in the 1 year 1917, more copper was mined, refined and manufactured into wire, tubing and sheet and other end products than in the total cumulative production of all the years of all human history before 1917. Wow.
Yeah.
With the war over, all the copper that had been mined and put into generators and conductors did not go back into the mines, nor did it rot. World War I was not an agrarian, but an inanimate energy and power-driven industrial production war, with the generating power coming from Niagara and other waterfalls, as well as from coal and petroleum. For the first time, the USA was generating power with oil-burning steam turbines. When the war was over, all this power production equipment was still in prime operating condition. There was enormous potential productivity, a wealth of wealth-producing capability that had never before existed, let alone as a consequence of war. The production capacity that had been established was so great as to have been able to produce within a 2-year span all those ships, trucks and armaments. What was the USA economy going to do with its new industrial gianthood? It was the vastness of this unexpected government-funded production wealth and its ownership by corporate stockholders that generated many negative thoughts about the moral validity of war profiteering.
Well, it's 10:45 and my version ran out and I've got to paste some more in there. Wow. So this is probably a good time to draw some conclusions.
Yep.
So Manu, how are you feeling and what's your takeaway today?
A lot.
Yeah.
But first, I'm feeling good, but also I feel sad. I'm feeling good because the way this is written is so much applicable today and will be tomorrow.
Mm.
It is always about energy and food. Gold, silver, copper, and land, water, and everything else to produce food. And you see, when you look at it, about what is going on in the world today, what is at play is the same. And for as long as there's no consciousness and practical kind of acceptance of it, that we are on the same spaceship called Earth, and that we are humans, it's going to be very difficult. Because what we are seeing today is that there have been an, if I can call an obfuscation of those real, what it is that you call wealth, is been hidden and replaced with things like debt. And everybody has got into the groove with debt. And it's been played shuffle to a certain limit. You need to reset. And that's where, I don't know if fortunately or unfortunately for us, we are at the crossroads of that requirement for the reset globally. And that is very important. But the most important to me is what kind of, I was going to say education. What kind of history are you tapping in? What are you learning? And how are you empowering yourself through education? Because whatever the case, you are left individual to position by your actions, right? In the flow of all of these things that are going to happen. And it is, again, whether I individually are here or not, things are going to happen. So you're grateful that things happen the way they're supposed to happen. But the big question is, you're grateful, how do you position yourself? And how do you position around you? And it only comes if you are educated, and you decide, and you take action, and that you cooperate with others. So that's my biggest takeaway, is that I'm so, I wouldn't say overwhelmed, I'm so grateful to Bucky to have seen and described things the way he did. But by the same token, I'm worried that not many people understand what is really going on. And that is our Achilles heel as communities. So I'll stop there. John, how do you feel? What do you take away?
I'm still stunned in this day and age with the communications we have at the ability of those with real power to manipulate the population and governments. Just that summary of how the war occurred, how it was financed, how Morgan played such a critical role in adding so hugely to his own wealth, those who worked with him. Governments, particularly the US government, was conned, and the lot of people was just reduced. The true standard of living. I mean, I remember from some of my earlier Bucky studies that Bucky wrote, I think, about the mid-80s, that the major governments of the world were spending $1,000 billion a year on weaponry and killingry, as he called it, of which about 400 billion was the US, 400 billion was Russia, and 200 billion was the rest of the world. And he worked out what could have been done to alleviate the world's major problems, which was a fraction of the total being spent on armaments and killingry, not defence. It's not defence. There's either livingry or killingry, according to Bucky. But the cost of the war and the consequences of the war and the manipulation of the war, and I don't think it's changed. I don't think it's really changed at all. I think exactly the same things are happening all over the planet. So it's great to understand what's happening, and it's great to be reminded of what Bucky tells us, his insights into what was going on. But it's still a little concerning that some 40 years later, Bucky was writing this 50 years ago, 60 years ago. I think he wrote this in the 60s. Doesn't seem to have really changed much. So, yeah. Very provocative, very thought-provoking, and very concerning. So that's how I'm feeling at the moment. So, Joe, how are you feeling? What do you take out of today?
I'm actually feeling a little sick at the moment, but I enjoyed tonight's reading. I think everybody, you guys both, Manu captured a lot of the, what was the main theme is just, some of these things that Bucky was writing about 50, 60 years ago are still going on today. And a lot of people don't know their history. And so they tend to think these things are just the way they are. And they accept things the way they are until they get too bad, and then they react. I'll just leave it at that. But there were a lot of important things that were said, but I think that the interesting thing was this idea of controlling the supply chains. I think that that's one of the most critical things. We're such an interconnected world right now. And you saw just the disruptions that we've had over the past, couple of years. And I think that that's demonstrating, if trade doesn't, if trade doesn't get done, how dependent we are on these things. And yeah, this is also another approach to modern finance. Just thinking about Morgan and how he worked with Edison and suppressed technology, essentially. Those are my major takeaways from this evening. I'm sorry, again, I'm a little bit feverish at this point, and a little nauseous. Steve, how do you feel? What are you taking away?
Well, I admire your courage for sticking in here, Joe, but I also encourage you to take care of yourself, and I'm glad you're able to stick through. Tonight, while you were reading, I have a copy of Critical Path here. And so I was listening and trying to keep up with the screen so I could be with you, John, and the group. And I also have been looking through this book, kind of like correlating different things. Like he's talking about at the turn of the century, he was 4 years old and remember his father at 1145 opening the window to allow the new century to come in. And that at the time, H.G. Wells was writing about a war in the air, but with the War of the Worlds, but nobody thought we would get to the moon, and therefore those people were called lunatics. It just, the way he is writing our history here, I mean, it's kind of, I learned real estate by accident. I learned about banking and discount rates. I remember going to real estate school and understanding net present values. And I remember the thing that blew me away was when I took the course on appraising, and they were using residual appraisal techniques to take a specific income stream and determine its net present value, the capital value of that income stream, and how they could be fractionalized. And that just blew me away. And what he points out here is the average person has no idea what wealth is. I don't have any idea what wealth is. I mean, I'm reading this, I'm going, those bastards, you know. But the point is that I guess, you know, I want to say we are taught exactly what we need to know to stay a cog in the wheel, right? And if I'm going to get out of that wheel and be something other than a cog, I've got to get educated. And the fact that Venice and Phoenicia had anything to do with each other, and the fact that phonetics and phonemics came from Phoenicia, who were trying to write up language so they could make more money and keep the commerce lines going back and forth. I mean, to have this kind of like understanding of what's going on and how ignorant I am. Wow, it just boggles me. I just really feel today, especially looking back in the book and correlating some of these parts and looking at these maps over and over again, and how I get trapped in a paradigm. And like he said, with the Eratosthenes map, 200 BC, the world was just flat. That's all it needed to be, because that's how the people were maintaining their power. And then he talks about progression as it goes from this ore to that ore to this ore, and suddenly now we go from this ore to copper, and now we're doing electronic communication, then we go to wireless communication. And to see how each of those paradigms bring in a potential for wealth, to learn about the fact that JP Morgan got loans to create products that would have taken years of necessity, but created more products than there were gold in the banks based on debt. It just boggles my mind. And then, you know, and he's saying it like JP Morgan was a mastermind and everybody was stupid. You know, he says, well, now you got to pay me back. So let's, you know, and all these countries started printing money, you know, he just writes such an interesting history. And I'm going to feel like this section is called Legally Piggly, which if we take out the cuteness, it's legal pigs. You know, what gives these, and he's talked about pirates before, but now he's talking about pigs. And I just let it happen. I don't know. To me, this whole thing, this has been really a revelation. And I'm slowly getting this picture, because every week we read, I'm going, oh, I never thought of that. Oh, I never thought of that. And to see how he sees it as these legal pigs. Anyway, it's blowing my mind. And to see what happened with World War II and how the
World War I.
Huh? Well, he
World
talked about
War I.
World War I, but in World War II, all that industry, and maybe World War I even, you're right, World War I, all the industry that had been developed in Europe got developed in America to create the products needed to save Europe. I mean, just, and you know, unwittingly, the US became this economic power. And that was then we got into World War II, and then we had Reynolds Wrap. I don't know if, I'm sure you guys remember Reynolds Wrap, the big on television, and it was a big thing. You got to have Reynolds Wrap. You have to have a washing machine. You got to have a dryer, and you got to have Reynolds Wrap. You know, it's quilted. Anyway, I'm just, I've lived my life buying Reynolds Wrap and didn't realize I love this. So I'm having a great time, and we ended at the perfect. I thought all night long, I thought, you know, I should probably add a few pages on there, but it worked out perfect. It's now 11:01. My time, and so that means we're 1 minute past the time for everybody. Thanks for hanging in there, guys.
Cool. Let me
Thanks,
ask you a
guys.
question
Yeah,
before you go. Maybe think about it. You say the US unwittingly
yeah,
became a world power.
yeah.
Who do you mean by the US?
Well,
Do you
I'm-
mean
I'm quoting-
the people,
No,
or do you mean
I mean the
some
pig.
other internationally representing what you call the US?
Yeah,
I just leave it to you to ponder on it.
you betcha.
So,
And I'm listening to Bobby Kennedy right now, Jr., he's talking about the CIA and all the crap with Eisenhower that got passed off to JFK and how the CIA killed JFK. I mean, all about, it's the war culture. It's all about power. And it's just amazing to see this background unfold,
yes.
the whole thing.
The only way you don't exercise brute power is through elevating your consciousness. And you elevate your consciousness, not some magic,
Yeah.
it's through education.
Yeah.
You have to be a lifelong learner of life, as I say, a lifelong learner of life.
That's for
So,
sure.
yes, it's only through that that you experience. And then one of the things that is important is the weight in lack. And that is really a sign of wisdom. How do you muster the energy, the will, and the decision to jump aside and just see things first before you jump back into action?
Yeah.
It's something I've been struggling with a long time.
Oh, cool.
I consider it a real trait of a wise person.
Cool.
All right.
We complete?
Yes.
All right, everybody. See you next week. John, good to have you. Hope you're going to.
Thank you, John.
Yes,
Excellent
I'll be here
reading.
next week. I'll be here next week.
Good deal.
Excellent reading.
Good.
Joe and you, really, you are our readers.
I was out of practice. I'll get better.
Well, actually, you did really well. You made it through some of those stumpy parts.
Okay.
Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you all.
Yes. Bye.